The first thing John noticed was the silence. It was oppressive, a thick, suffocating absence of sound that seemed to press down on him from all sides. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was even alive. His body felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if the air around him had been replaced with a viscous, invisible sludge. Slowly, the feeling returned to his limbs, and with it, the first tingling edges of fear. He opened his eyes. Darkness, an endless, inky blackness stretched before him in all directions, swallowing everything. He blinked, hoping his vision would adjust, but it didn't. His heart began to pound, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he sat up, the texture beneath his hands registered, cold, rough stone, damp and uneven. It was like lying on the bedrock of a long-forgotten cave, but it wasn't a cave. The air was too thick, too hot. His skin prickled with a heat that seemed to come from within the very stone, radiating upwards in slow, painful waves. Then, far in the distance, a dull red glow appeared. It was barely a pinprick of light, but in the overwhelming blackness, it stood out like a beacon. John's breath caught in his throat as he scrambled to his feet, his shoes scraping against the stone, sending a cascade of tiny pebbles tumbling into the void. He wasn't alone, he could feel it. Something was watching him from within that glow. He hesitated, his mind reeling with disjointed memories. An accident, the screech of tires, a flash of pain. And then nothing. Where was he? His body ached, as if he had been crushed under an immense weight. He took a step toward the glow, and then another, drawn toward it despite the gnawing fear in his gut. The glow grew larger as he approached, revealing the vague outlines of jagged rocks and twisted formations. The terrain was treacherous, the stone beneath his feet brittle and sharp. He stumbled, almost falling, and his hand shot out to catch himself on a nearby rock. The surface was warm to the touch, and as he withdrew his hand, he noticed it was covered in a thin film of dark, viscous liquid. Blood. A deep guttural groan echoed through the darkness, reverberating off the stone walls. John froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. A low, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate through the very air, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. It was the sound of something ancient, something tortured. The glow ahead flickered, growing brighter, revealing more of the surrounding landscape. The ground sloped downward into a vast, jagged valley. The rocks and cliffs twisted into impossible shapes. Pools of molten lava bubbled and spat, casting a sickly orange light across the landscape. The sky, or whatever passed for it, was a swirling mass of dark clouds, shot through with veins of crimson lightning that crackled and writhed like living things. John's heart pounded in his chest as he descended into the valley. The heat intensified with every step, sweat pouring down his face in rivulets. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and charred flesh, a nauseating mixture that made his stomach churn. As he reached the valley floor, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He staggered, barely keeping his balance, and looked around wildly. It was then that he saw them. Silhouetted against the fiery glow were figures, human shapes, but distorted, twisted. They writhed in agony, their bodies bound in chains that glowed with a dull red heat. Some were suspended from the jagged rocks, their limbs contorted into impossible angles, while others were forced to march in endless circles, their faces frozen in expressions of utter despair. A scream tore through the air, high-pitched and piercing, echoing across the valley. John turned toward the source and saw a figure standing at the edge of a pool of lava. Its skin was blistered and charred, flesh hanging in ragged strips from its bones. The figure clawed at its own face, trying in vain to escape the unbearable heat, but there was no escape. The lava bubbled and hissed, and with a final pitiful wail, the figure collapsed into the molten pool, vanishing beneath the surface. John stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. He had to get out of here. Wherever here was, he couldn't stay, but as he turned to flee, he found the way blocked. Standing before him was a massive figure, easily twice his height, its body a twisted mass of sinew and muscle. Its skin was a deep, sickly green, mottled with patches of red and black. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and when it opened its mouth, rows of jagged yellow teeth were revealed. The creature spoke, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through John's very bones. "Welcome, sinner," it hissed, the words dripping with venom. You have entered the domain of the damned. There is no escape, no salvation. You are ours for eternity." John stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't think of anything he had done to deserve this. What had he done to be condemned to this hellish place? "Why?" he managed to croak, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Why am I here?" The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You know why." It snarled, taking a step forward. The ground shook beneath its feet. "All who come here know. You have sinned, mortal, and now you will suffer for all eternity." John's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, the rough stone scraping his hands and knees. Desperation clawed at him, but no matter how hard he tried to remember, he couldn't recall what had led him to this place. The accident, the pain, nothing more. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, as if some part of him was refusing to acknowledge the truth. The creature loomed over him, its eyes burning with an unholy light. "It is time," it growled. "Your punishment awaits." Before John could react, the creature's massive hand shot out, wrapping around his torso like a vice. He was lifted off the ground, the air forced from his lungs by the sheer pressure of the creature's grip. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The creature carried him effortlessly across the valley, its long strides eating up the distance. As they moved deeper into the hellish landscape, the temperature continued to rise. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and burning flesh, the heat searing his skin. The sounds of torment grew louder, screams, wails, and cries of agony echoing from every direction. The ground beneath them was a churning sea of lava, rivers of molten rock winding through the jagged terrain like fiery serpents. At last, they arrived at a massive iron gate set into the side of a mountain. The gate was adorned with grotesque carvings, twisted faces contorted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. The creature stopped before the gate, and with a deep reverberating roar, it called out to the darkness beyond. The gate groaned as it slowly swung open, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with thick, choking smoke. The heat was unbearable, waves of it radiating from the glowing embers that lined the chamber walls. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, and upon it lay a figure, writhing in agony. Chains bound the figure's limbs, glowing red-hot as they seared into the flesh. The creature carried John to the altar and threw him down beside it. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and he lay there gasping, his vision swimming. He looked up at the figure on the altar, and his heart froze. It was him. His own face, twisted in pain, stared back at him, eyes wide with terror. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. He was already dead, and this was his eternity. There was no escape, no waking up from this nightmare. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a sadistic pleasure. "Your suffering begins now," it growled, raising one massive clawed hand. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's claws descended, and the last thing he saw was his own face, reflected in the molten metal of the chains. When he opened his eyes again, the silence returned, the oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on him from all sides. His body felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if the air around him had been replaced with a viscous, invisible sludge. Slowly the feeling returned to his limbs, and with it, the first tingling edges of fear. He opened his eyes. Darkness, an endless inky blackness stretched before him in all directions, swallowing everything. He blinked, hoping his vision would adjust, but it didn't. His heart began to pound, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he sat up, the texture beneath his hands registered, cold, rough stone, damp and uneven. It was like lying on the bedrock of a long-forgotten cave. But again, it wasn't a cave. The air was too thick, too hot. His skin prickled with a heat that seemed to come from within the very stone, radiating upwards in slow, painful waves. A sense of déjà vu washed over him, chilling him despite the searing heat. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, and glanced around at the darkness. There was something eerily familiar about the rough, uneven stone beneath his hands, the oppressive silence, and the void that stretched out before him. It was as if he had been here before. Then, far in the distance, the same dull red glow appeared, piercing the blackness like a bloodshot eye. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.